Okay, this is our second video looking at the humanistic approach in psychology. So in the last video we spoke about the notion of humans having free will, the idea that although there are constraints upon our behaviour, we are still self-determining and we are still able to have choice over our actions. And we also spoke about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs and self-actualization at the top. So in this video we're going to be looking at the emphasis on the self or the self-concept and what it means to achieve congruence. We're going to be looking at our limitations on achieving congruence, so we'll be looking at conditions of worth, and then finally we'll be looking at how the humanistic psychology, particularly Rogers, has had an influence on counselling psychology through the use of unconditional positive regard. So, just a little bit of background on Carl Rogers, another very happy man who wanted to reject the notions of behaviourism and reject the psychodynamic approach and the works of Freud. And again, he was focusing on what was good with people. And he wanted to emphasise how individuals strive to achieve their ideal selves. He thought that individuals were inherently motivated towards self-improvement. So the reason I've got a little potato here, Rogers was inspired by looking at potatoes that were growing in his parents' basement. So in the deep, dark, dingy recesses of their basement, he found that potatoes were still striving to grow. They were still sprouting. And he thought that this was a nice analogy for humans, that even when humans are down and in poor conditions, they were still striving to improve themselves and striving to grow. And he thought this was a nice analogy to explain human behaviour. So you can read this quote here. Again, a very, very positive approach by Carl Rogers. So one of his main theories and ideas in the humanistic approach is the idea of the self. So the self or the self-concept refers to how we see ourselves. Feelings of self-worth develop in childhood, and they stem from a child's interactions, first of all, with parents. And then later on with teachers, with friends, in adulthood, with spouses and significant others. And how we think about ourselves and our feelings of self-worth are really important for our psychological health. So the closer our self or self-concept is to our ideal self, who we feel we should be or would ideally like to be, how close they are to one another, our self and our ideal self, the greater the feelings of our self-worth, and then the greater our psychological health. But the idea of ourself stems from childhood and has an impact on our psychological health. So congruence is when there is similarity between a person's ideal self and how they perceive themselves to be in real life, so their self-concept. When there is similarity, they are in a state of congruence. Greater congruence means greater feelings of self-worth. If there is a gap between our ideal self and our actual self, then we are in a state of incongruence. And this means that we've got lower feelings of self-worth, and this is likely to impact and worsen our psychological health. Complete congruence, complete consistency between ourself and our ideal self is quite rare. We all experience this to some degree, but the greater the feelings of incongruence, the lower the feelings of self-worth and feelings of maladjustment, and the lower our psychological health. And we can measure our congruence via the Q-sort assessment. And you guys are going to have an opportunity to assess yourselves and measure your congruence in our humanistic lessons. So just to visualize this, when there is similarity between ourself, who we think we are, who we see ourselves in real life, and our ideal self, who we would like to be and who we feel like we want to be, then we're experiencing congruence. And you can see here by the happy faces that congruence means we've got higher feelings of self-worth and we've got healthier psychological health and well-being. You can see here that incongruence is when there is a discrepancy, when there is inconsistency between how we see ourselves and who we would like to be. So we might see ourselves as this miserable guy here, but we would like to be happy-go-lucky. Whenever there's a gap between the two or inconsistency, we're experiencing congruence. And we've got low self-worth and we've got lower psychological health. All right, so I've just altered the slides here. So you'll see on the next slide your conditions of worth. So Rogers believed that it was other people who were often a hindrance to us achieving congruence and consistency between self and ideal self. So the love and acceptance that we receive from other people, particularly our parents and our loved ones, may be unconditional. And this is referred to as unconditional positive regard. And this is when a person is accepted for who they are or what they do, no matter what. We say that this is unconditional. On the other hand, the love and acceptance that an individual receives might be conditional. And this is when they're only accepted if they do what others want them to do and they be who others want them to be. When people receive this conditional positive regard, love that is conditional upon them being who others want them to be, they develop what's called conditions of worth. And these are conditions that they perceive significant others, like parents, put upon them. And they believe that these have to be in place in order to be accepted by others and to see themselves positively. So an individual can only experience a sense of self-acceptance if they meet the expectations that others have set as conditions of acceptance. So the conditions of worth are conditions that individuals perceive must be present in order for the child to see themselves positively and to have self-acceptance. So I just want to show you an example of this, and you can see a pretty horrific example here in this little cartoon. So an example could be a father who only shows affection and only spends time with his son when the son is playing football and playing well in games, despite the fact that the son himself actually might be more of a musician, might hate football, and might prefer performing. That child then, because the father is only showing affection and spending time with him when he's a good footballer, the son then develops conditions of worth. He believes that he is not worthy of his father's love unless he is good at football. This is a condition that he feels must be fulfilled in order to be worthy of his father's love and acceptance. And this is why it's called conditions of worth. So conditions of worth hinder us and they stop us achieving congruence because we feel like we must live up to other people's expectations. So this then leads us on nicely to the influence on counselling psychology. So conditions of worth are developed through conditional positive regard from others. So Rogers developed client-centered therapy, which involves unconditional positive regard. And this is where the therapist expresses their acceptance and their understanding of the client, regardless of the feelings and the attitudes that the client expresses. So even if the client is really negative and not self-accepting and doesn't particularly like themselves as a person, the therapist is always going to be accepting and understanding of anything they say and do. And the aim of this is to help to overcome and dissolve the conditions of worth that were placed upon that child throughout their childhood and perhaps as adults as well. So in order to do this, they are always friendly, always accepting. They're never going to be critical and never going to require change from the client. They're always going to be accepting and understanding. And this helps the client to move towards being more authentic and being their true selves, not who others want them to be. So Rogers' ideas of the self and the ideas of congruence had a big influence on counselling psychology. And we still see this used in CBT. We still see this used in modern day psychotherapy. So it has had a big influence in the world of counselling psychology. All right, so to just sum up the assumptions of the humanistic approach, you'll remember that the humanists argue that we have free will over our behaviour, that we are self-determining as humans, and that we are in control of our destiny. Humanists emphasise the importance of the self and the idea that we should achieve congruence by having similarity between our self and our ideal self. Incongruence comes about through conditions of worth that have been placed on us by our significant others, by our parents in childhood, and they prevent us from personal growth because they create this discrepancy or this inconsistency between our self and our ideal self. Maslow emphasised the importance of self-actualization and how we can achieve this only by fulfilling lesser needs, and this is represented by his hierarchy of needs. And the influence on positive psychology has been through the use of unconditional positive regard by therapists, which help to dissolve conditions of worth and help the client become more authentic, more true to themselves, and not who others want them to be. So the humanistic approach is really a positive approach, and although not scientific, it rejects science, it is anti-science, it has an influence on the world of psychology.